Hello, we will begin shortly. Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining today's virtual Sun session. My name is Rebecca Cherry and I'm part of the marketing team here at Laerdal. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions during the session, please share them via the Q&A feature that can be found at the bottom of your screen. I'll be monitoring them during the session and we'll have time for questions at the end. To ensure you are all able to see all speakers, select the gallery view. Recordings will be emailed to you after the session is over to watch on demand. Now I would like to introduce the moderator, Andrew Kostopik.
Hi everyone, and welcome from sunny New York today. We've been lucky. Every one of these virtual suns, it's been a nice day. We hope it's a nice day where you are. I am the Senior Content Marketing Manager for Laerdal, and I've been fortunate to be the host for these sessions all this year during 2020. Today I'm privileged and humbled to introduce Susan Gross-Forneris, the Director of the NLN Center for Innovation Education Excellence at the National League of Nursing. Susan, welcome. Thanks for being here with us today.
Thanks, Andrew.
Really good to have you. Why don't you tell everybody, we have right now close to 500 participants. The number keeps climbing as people are joining, so that's a good thing. We like to see it. Why don't you tell those out there a little bit about yourself and what you do there at the NLN?
Sure. Thanks, Andrew. Well, actually, I have been a nurse for over 40 years and a nurse educator for the last 20 plus years, a little over 20 years. So I come from a pretty varied background, but education has always been a thread in the work that I've done, both in my clinical days as well as my academic days. So I've been with the National League for Nursing now a little over 7 years. And at the time that I started there, the league had just transitioned from New York City to Washington, D.C., and had established some centers within their organization that would focus on certain areas of work. And simulation and technology was one of the centers. And I came in as a fellow and worked with the National League for Nursing as a scholar in residence fellow for about 1.5 to 2 years. Well, actually 2 years, I would say. And then I transitioned into a full-time position where I was directing the center. And last year, mid-last 2019, the NLN really wanted to focus and shift to a broader perspective because faculty development and is really the heart of the work that the NLN is doing. And so with a more broadened scope, embracing all of technology as a component of education excellence. And so the center expanded to be the Center for Innovation and Education Excellence, where we really are focused on building momentum and more dialogue with our constituents around the table through a lot of different activities that really will help to move faculty along that continuum as
Sure.
we embrace the challenges that we're facing in education.
And we've got a great shot here of some of the team at the NLN. This is everybody there. Before you comment just a little bit more about the NLN and what an interesting place to be right now, by the way, holy moly. So a couple things. Some people have said they've had a little difficulty hearing, so we'll try to adjust on our end. Both Susan and I will, but apparently our voices are broadcasting fine. The other is just want to reemphasize to people, please use the Q&A feature. I always gloss over that. And what we need to do, please, is if everyone can use the Q&A feature, we are going to be taking questions at the end. So we're going to reserve 15 minutes of time to take everyone's questions. Please populate those in the Q&A feature. So yes, you're in the middle of a really interesting arena right now, both politically, but also in terms of healthcare, because healthcare is always politically a hot topic. So tell us just a little bit more about the Center for Innovation and Education Excellence, and anything you'd like to comment on the NLN, or even just give your team a shout out.
Great. Yeah, well, actually, I appreciate that, because I do want to shout out to my wonderful colleagues at the National League for Nursing. You know, the NLN is on remote status, as most organizations are. So many of us who work in DC are now working from our home homes. I am coming to you today from Minneapolis, Minnesota. So I'm a Minnesotan at heart, but actually am missing being in DC with the exciting activity that's happening. And sometimes that's good and sometimes that's bad. But the center and the staff, we all work very collaboratively and the centers actually work with one another. I work very strategically with our Center for the Advancing the Science of Nursing Education Research, which is directed by Dr. Barbara Patterson. And then we have the Center for Transformational Leadership, which is directed by our Chief Program Officer, Dr. Janice Brewington. Innovation in education excellence is really focused on teaching and learning strategies. It's focused on faculty development. And we use as sort of a backdrop to that our nurse educator competencies, so that faculty are prepared and teaching, you know, at the top of their game to this new generation of learners. And we're really committed to helping faculty bring in the latest in neuroscience and brain science research into teaching in a new way, and in a way that is effective and will help transition from teaching content to teaching our learners how to use the content.
Sure. That's a great segue. Thank you very much. That's a great segue into our topic today, which is rethinking the practice of teaching. So we had an interesting discussion before when we just went through the agenda for today, and it was a discussion about change this year. And so I'll throw this statement out to you, and then you can comment on it in terms of why are we focused on rethinking the practice of teaching. And the statement is, we've invested a lot in change and coping with change this year, but have we missed potentially the real target, which is rethinking the practice of teaching? What say you?
Yeah, you know, that is a really a good reflective question, Andrew. You know, one of the things that we often have conversations about is that this has been a really interesting year so far. I think, if anything, the one certainty we have is that innovation is alive and well, because we've had to do that, to make things work. But I think we are in this period of time where we're really trying to be less reactionary. I think the first part of the year, I don't think it was progress or change. I think it was reaction. And for many faculty, I think they did the best they could to meet things that were thrown at them in overnight changes that they had to make. And one of the things that this uncertainty and innovation have revealed is that we really don't have a good grasp on teaching. I think it has been a year that has defined those that know how to teach from those that don't know how to teach, regardless of whether you have technology or not. And I think that's the key here. This is not a new conversation. Online remote teaching is not new. It's been in vogue for at least the last 20 years. And back in the 80s, Chickering and Gamson in higher education put out a seminal work that was entitled The 7 Principles of Best Teaching and Learning in Higher Ed. And it was further elaborated on, some of those principles, in the work that Patricia Benner and her colleagues did with transforming nursing education, and that was 10 years ago. So this dialogue that we continually have about how we have to transform the way we teach it continues to evolve. If anything, COVID has forced it to happen, has forced us to have that aha moment, and the reality, the realization that much of what we thought was good teaching is not. And remote, I think, escalates that a bit.
There you go, and can expedite change, but also unmask potentially some pitfalls or some gaps. It can magnify some gaps that already exist.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, I think one of the things that we've noted is that, action that we've taken isn't necessarily the right action all the time. It might have filled a void, but was it the right fit? And I think that's what the NLN and our center is really trying to do. And the focus of this dialogue today is really trying to drive and us to rethink about this a bit.
Excellent, thank you. So first we're going to move to a polling question, and as we continue, I think that the agenda that we've laid out makes for a nice debrief in a sense, or could be used as a reflective debrief once everyone's done with this session on, okay, we've managed to cope this year, but under the underlying foundation, maybe we need to take a harder look at that as we rethink the practice of teaching. So we have a polling question, and that's going to appear in just a moment on your screen. I'll read the questions to you. There we are. So in what ways have you, in the audience, had to rethink the practice of teaching during 2020? Choices: I had to go virtual with little or no preparation. B, I had to amp up my ability to keep students engaged. C, I had to face concerns that my students were getting only part of their needed educational experience. Then E, yep, E. This is live, folks. Sometimes this happens. I had to scramble to find new technologies to support my teaching, and then all of the above. And that's sort of a serious, really, it's not meant to be a softball for everyone. Please only answer all of the above if that's true. So let's see where people land. Okay, so all of the above. That's what I was expecting. And the spread is fairly even for those that chose one or the other. So the bottom line is, it's been a difficult year for everybody, and so we're going to talk about how one might deal with those difficulties, and you're going to make some recommendations for us. So next we're going to turn to one of my favorite quotes, and you've said it before in our sessions. No, we're going to actually turn to the Horizon Report. My bad. And then we're going to get to your favorite quote. But first, let's talk about the Horizon. I'm glad you're having fun here, Susan. So the Horizon Report. Let's talk about the Horizon Report and why it's important. Why is the Horizon Report important, and should everyone know it?
Well, Andrew, it's interesting because rethinking the practice of teaching is actually driven from the work of the Horizon Report. And many of you may be familiar with this. Technology leaders in education are very familiar. The Horizon Report is actually the result of the Horizon Project, which was an initiative by launched in 2002 by New Media Consortium, and it has moved at that point now. It's managed by EDUCAUSE, which is a nonprofit association. It's the largest community of technology, academic leaders, industry leaders, campus leaders, all looking at this notion of how technology in our workplaces is influencing what happens in higher education, and how higher education is using technology to work with our learners in those learning spaces. And prior to 2020, they released their 2020 report in this past spring. And the report in the past has kind of focused on key trends and key challenges. Trends in technology that were driving education, as well as significant challenges that were impeding technology. And one of the things that that is interesting is when you read the report and you kind of take a look at the challenges, they're things that we probably are already encountering as educators, and how are our institutions working to make those challenges less, for us to adopt and embrace and use technology so it becomes a fluid means of delivering teaching and learning. And when they divided the challenges up, they identified challenges as either solvable challenges, and those would be things that we understand or we know how to solve. They would identify another set of challenges as difficult, those that we understand but solutions are elusive or not so sure. And then there are what I just love, the wicked challenges, and those that are very complex, not so sure we can define them, and the ability to address them is even more obscure. And in 2019, there were two, and the one that caught my attention was Rethinking the Practice of Teaching. And that one I just really resonated with me, because it's this constant conversation, as we mentioned before, that we really need to begin to address. And we need to stop talking about it and start developing resources, and providing faculty with the things that they need in order to be able to do what it is they're supposed to do and be successful, for students to achieve their learning outcomes, to graduate, to transition into their professional roles successfully. The National League for Nursing and Wolters Kluwer did, several years ago, also did a study with our member schools and deans to try to understand how nursing education programs were currently using educational technology. And we wrote a series of blogs that are posted on our Nursing Edge blog in collaboration with Wolters Kluwer, the findings of those studies. And the same thing, it was really difficult. It's not taking technology and embedding it. It's using the technology in a way that creates context. And it's that whole rethinking that's built around, we have to stop teaching content and start teaching how to use the content, because it's not going to magically come to fruition for learners when they hit the practice setting. They have to practice using the content before they get there.
I think that's an interesting point, because skills, we had this discussion earlier, also skills can always be adjusted, right?
Absolutely.
But thinking like a nurse, like an autonomous care provider, and also within your autonomous world, with the autonomy you're given as a leader, thinking as a leader and being able to perform critical thinking on the spot is is very different from just being focused on skills. So,
Yeah. Well,
so please.
go ahead. No, go ahead.
No, you go ahead, please.
Well, I was just going to say, I think there's vulnerability in that. I think it's hard to step away if we think about how we react in practice, even when we're precepting or working with our colleagues. To have to defend a rationale for action in the moment is always incredibly, challenging, especially if you're uncertain. And but we do it every day. We do it every day in practice, and it seems as though we're less likely to want to do that in front of our learners. And our learners need to see us not as having every single answer, but what do we do when we don't know the answer? And I think that's really important. And that just takes time to develop the confidence to share how you're seeing something, regardless of whether it's off base or on base.
Sure.
On target.
Absolutely. So now we get to your favorite quote,
Yeah.
or one of them at least, yeah. Sorry, I was so eager, but it set up this anticipation for everybody online. So so here we are. We must stop lecturing. I've heard you say that before.
Yeah.
Some online have probably heard it if they've attended one of our sons in person. So why do you believe so strongly in this?
Oh, because I think lecture is a one-way dialogue. It's a monologue. It's not even a dialogue. We
Sure.
call it monologue. My dear colleague, Dr. Mary Fay, and I have been publishing some monographs, and just published this fall the second volume of our critical conversations, moving from monologue to dialogue. And, I think I've even stopped using, and I did in my teaching days before I came to the NLN, I stopped using the word lecture. Because I just thought, well, I want to engage them in a conversation. They're coming to class for an experience. They're not coming for me to, pour everything I know into their head, and then they're going to walk away. Unfortunately, that's how we were taught. We were all taught by lecture. But where has that left us? Our learners just aren't empty vessels, even though that's what they expect, because it's hard to learn. Learners come to class and they expect you to give them the answers. And how do we set up our class learning encounters so that it's very clear what the expectations are for roles in the class, and how performance is going to be evaluated, both in the form of give and take dialogue during the class, as well as our objective tests. So I think the other side of that is that lectures are safe. They're self-contained. If we have this little PowerPoint with all of our objective information that we can rely on, it also sets up clear boundaries, kind of in hidden, somewhat hidden. I mean,
there's no risk in it.
There's no risk.
Yeah,
the boundaries are there, and we know, students know when and they can and can't ask questions.
Sure.
And that protects us from the question we might not know the answer to. So I think part of the notion of dialogue instead of lecture is dialogue creates a little more curiosity. We're responsible, to create that curiosity about how our learners are putting the pieces together. And content can be delivered, but in short chunks. So if we're paying attention to neuroscience research and brain science research, lectures in the form of 10-minute chunks of content where we integrate checking in, embedding a dialogue, understanding how our learners might be putting the pieces together. That is what neuroscience is telling us is working. Strategies like retrieval practices, helping our learners get in touch with the content. But again, it's about how we set the table. How we set the table will dictate what our learners will and won't pick up. Sure. In terms of using, and it's up to them, but there has to be clear expectations about how this class runs, what the expectations are coming to class, and very transparent from the beginning. So part of it is that learning encounter that's safe, that are no surprises, no gotchas, and sets up a chance for them to really try on the content in the classroom. So I just have had way more effective dialogue with, I always was a bookend faculty, so I always had on average 100 some students in a lecture hall and try to create small group work in that. But it can be done, and I have colleagues who do it very successfully. So I just really feel strongly about this need
Would
to create encounters. Yeah.
would you agree that also a student feels a greater sense of respect too when you're having a dialogue with them rather than, to your point of a monologue or speaking
Yeah.
at them, and I'm paraphrasing, that sense of respect, not for nothing. I mean, people worked hard to get into nursing school,
Right.
and I'm sure that establishes a bridge when you're
Well, it
having a
does.
dialogue with them.
Yeah, I mean, and it can't be a gotcha dialogue. Our ability to ask questions isn't based on rapid fire questions. Can they get the answer? Because I'm always curious, you're great, spot on. You have that is exactly, what I'm thinking. Tell me how you got to that answer. We don't take enough time to find out how they're putting the pieces together.
Sure.
And, I think there are lots of strategies when you mix and match some of these brain science strategies to give learners a chance to try things on in different ways. It also informs you about whether you're moving toward achieving the outcomes for that time frame that you're with them.
Absolutely. So that's so let's transition now to another um, um, a theme that you often talk about. So we'll just wait for the next slide to tee up. There we go. BLUF, if for those that love acronyms, bottom line up front, how should we really be thinking about simulation?
Mm,
Because I remember you talked about stories,
yeah. You
and
know,
that you're really creating a story for people.
yeah, exactly. Simulation is really, for me, when you read about teaching in the past, and even you think about John Dewey, who's the father of education back in the 30s, believed that life itself was education, the ability for students to pick things up, to touch things, to listen to things, to examine, to question one another, to really think about the situation in front of them. And I think simulation does that. It's not about the technology. I think too often nursing education simulation gets a bad rap. It's that thing, and you've heard me say this before, is that your people compartmentalize, and sim is this thing that happens down the hall in that lab, and I don't deal with that in my teaching. I just send my students down there and hope something magical happens, and if it does, great. If it doesn't, I mean, and there are faculty out there who don't understand that. But sim is context, and really what we're trying to do is create a contextual learning situation. When you think about Patricia Benner's work, From Novice to Expert, she often talks about novice nurses are acontextual. They come to us without any stories of practice. And expert nurses rely on their stories of practice, because we build our expertise and our repertoire of knowledge based on our experiences, and we draw on those experiences as we come in touch with new experiences. But our new learners don't have that, and in today's world, they have to hit the floor in a much bigger way and harder way than I did 40 years ago when I started nursing. The expectation for performance is far greater. And so we have to provide them with stories during their building of their nursing knowledge through their program of study, and simulation provides that in many different ways of sim, virtual sim, sim used in the context of skills, sim in a sim lab, sim in the form of an unfolding case study where you might have dialogue and simulated participants acting out parts of the case study. All of these are forms of storytelling, and in the end, our learners have the opportunity to journey through that story, have a chance to try on their own questions, their own thinking. And if we're dialoguing with them in such a way that we're sharing how we're seeing a situation, and in turn asking how they see the situation, giving them some what ifs kinds of a thing that they can begin to work through. What if this were going on? Let's change the metrics here and see what happens. All of those create story and complexity to story, and that's contextual learning, and that's where we need to be.
And I must confess, I've always thought of someone new to anything as someone not having experience, but I really hadn't thought of it in terms of atextual, someone that just doesn't have context. And stories stick. There's absolutely no doubt. Stories stick. We used the reference the other day. Okay, so it was mine. I take responsibility for it. But Isaac Newton and the apple, right? There's a big difference between talking to a young person about gravity and the formula for force just on a blackboard with a piece of chalk versus here's a story and here's how supposedly this man discovered the formula for force. So, and understood broader and deeper gravity. You're kind to be smiling. But stories stick, and stories provide context, and that's really what simulation does. And that's ultimately your point. And to give people that context before they even go onto the job, that's pretty powerful. So why don't we move now to a polling question? We'll poll the audience again. And 2020, we all know it's been one heck of a year. So 2020 has forced instructors to adopt new technologies just to keep training moving forward. And I think that's very true. For those of you in the audience, what has been your biggest hurdle? Here are your choices. None, I've got this. Speed at which I had to adopt new technologies. Barriers that new technologies seem to have created between me and my students. Budget, that's a perennial favorite. Budget to afford new technologies. And last choice, forget the new technology, I need help with basic faculty development. So we didn't give you an all of the above on this one, so let's please see where people land. Please choose. And interesting, okay, so budget. Laerdal sales personnel listening, please dial into that. Maybe we can help. The speed at which we had to adopt new technologies, I think that was, that's a theme we saw from clients across the board. It was almost painful to see how quickly people had to scramble just to keep their classes moving forward. And then barriers that new technologies seem to have created. And we're going to talk about that in just a moment. So thank you very much, everyone, for answering. So let's go to the hurdles. We're going to advance to the next slide. From your perspective, Sue, and what you're seeing, where's the true hurdle? Where's the fundamental hurdle in teaching today's students, in your opinion? I'm sure everybody's going to share the same.
Well, you know, it's understanding how this generation of learners works. You know, I think the piece that's always fascinating to me is that if you give them the opportunity to take shortcuts, they will. So,
okay.
So how how do we embrace our learners as part of the learning solution? I think there's this notion of learner centered, and so if we keep the learner at the center of this, many times I found, even when I was actively teaching in higher ed, who was the center, me or the learners? And if I was doing more work than my learners were, then something was wrong here. And I think with technology, it's not about the technology. I think it's about how do we embrace students using it, and then the outcomes of the use of that technology, both to enhance, to activate, to give them a chance to practice. Um, it's if we're using technology and we're getting outcomes, are we paying attention to the data that we're getting from the technology we're using? Or is the technology just a means to an end? And students will figure that out. We figure that out, when you're doing something for the sake of doing it, but you're really not sure why. I think sometimes it sort of is begin with the end in mind. I think sometimes we want to use the technology because we have to, but is it the best way to achieve the outcome we're after? And I think that the hurdle is the foundational elements of good teaching, which is you go to a class with a lesson plan, and many times your lesson plan is not the PowerPoint you're delivering. That's not your lesson plan. Your lesson plan for transparency to your learners are what are the 2-3 ahas the student's going to take away at the end of that time they're with you. And I build my strategies so that I am getting feedback during the course of my time with them that tells me they've met those learning outcomes. So if we're not achieving the learning outcomes that we're attempting to do, and that those learning outcomes tell us something about how students are going to perform in the next series of classes, then we're sort of missing the boat. And I think we can't let technology be the answer if we're not using it in a thoughtful way. So I'm often amazed. We do, the NLN does quite a bit of teaching across the country, and we do a series of faculty intensives where we, basically it's a boot camp for teaching and learning. And I'm amazed at the numbers of faculty sometimes who have never heard of a lesson plan, who don't understand that there is a lesson plan for a class, and that those lesson plans should drive a course outcome, that there are course outcomes that are mapped to level outcomes in a program that are mapped to program outcomes. And, we're functioning within a curriculum map, and that map drives the strategies. And there are some outcomes that are better met with technology than others. And it's not until we know what it is we're attempting to do in that 2-hour, 3-hour, 1-hour time frame, that's what we have to keep in mind. What are those outcomes that build on bigger outcomes? And that will drive how we're using technology. So for me, I think the hurdle is not knowing how and when to use it.
Sure.
And thoughtfully using it.
How do you feel about, and we're going to move on in just a second, but how do you feel about just the topic of engagement and keeping people engaged, keeping students engaged? Because I'm sure that what we're seeing here on the screen is not uncommon. Would you like to make any comments on engagement before we move on?
Yeah, I think it's the same as, you get video fatigue, and so, there's a lot in brain science about chunking and checking in, to do things in bite-sized pieces. and that forces us as faculty to really think about what's the most important thing I have to get across today, not a checklist of 40 points that I have to make sure I cover in 3 hours. That will lose your learner in no time. So I think transparency about what it is you're trying to accomplish in that time frame and how you're going to do that, and seeing that students are part of that. You can't control everything. You're across
Sure.
the screen and remote, in the classroom, and it's all about how my colleagues and I who teach together a lot talk about, it's all in how you set the table. You can't make them eat, but you can set the table and make it transparent about what the expectations are. And if we keep our learners in high regard, if we're holding our learners and knowing that they're going to do their best and expecting that they're giving their best to meet these benchmarks, they're not purposely wanting to do poorly. They
Sure.
want to meet those benchmarks. So it really is sort of a reversal on how you approach it. Those would be my comments about engagement.
Excellent. Thank you. So why don't we move ahead? We have received a number of interesting comments. Student access to technology.
Oh, yes.
And so here's we're going to talk low tech for a minute, because I think I hope I don't know if you'll agree that sometimes we overlook the low tech, or seemingly low tech, in our dialogue around technology. But here's an example, and yes, it is a Laerdal product. It's the Laerdal Modular Skills Trainer, which was designed as a skills trainer that students can take home and actually use in any form of, it doesn't have to be virtual learning, but certainly can be used in the context of virtual learning from the home. And this skills trainer that we're looking at, even though it may seem rather simple, offers the ability for someone to perform at least 13 skills on this. So Susan, what do you think about the lower end of the spectrum in technology and the course of learning?
Yeah, I think it builds on, your learning outcomes. Again, depending upon what it is you're trying to achieve, you pick the right technology for the right outcome. And the modular skills trainer, I know the NLN has collaborated and done some work with this skills trainer. There's actually 21 skills embedded in this trainer. And we wanted to bring context to the trainer. So, we had our author, simulation consultant, Dr. Mary Cato, was the author of this, and it was putting story with skill, because there's a difference between a checklist of skills, because you got to start somewhere. You got to have a checklist so that that drives how you do the skill. But it's not that checklist that the learner's going to be able to pull out every single time they have to do the skill. And learning a skill off of a checklist with an arm or a IV arm or something like that isn't necessarily how they're going to see that skill when they have to use it. So if we can help create context through the use of some case studies or situations that all of a sudden they're in the middle of a skill and now they have to think about this. It's that creating that a little bit of cognitive dissonance, in the sense that I'm thinking, now I have to think and do together. How do you put those two things together? And so even the lowest form of technology, I think about oranges. For those of you who might be as old as me, back in the day, we had oranges to give injections on.
And suturing on grapes and things like that.
Exactly. And they still do use bananas to practice suturing. But, I think the point is that it depends on what it is you're trying to achieve in the moment. And sometimes the technology gets ramped up, the more dissonance or fidelity you're trying to create for different kinds of thinking. So again, beautiful example of where very simple technology can have really profound outcomes for learners.
Great. Thank you. We'll move now to the other end of the extreme. So high tech. What are some high tech aids that instructors should be considering right now? And here we're looking at vSim for nursing, so virtual simulation, and that's also something that is available through Laerdal. But what would your comments be?
Well, some of when you think about simulation, especially when you get into the desktop and the screen-based virtual, to me, this is all built on gaming strategy. And we have learned so much from our youth and those of us, I'm not a gamer, but I know I have a son who's a gamer. We have friends who are gamers. People learn different things through gaming, and I think the ability to have a piece of technology that's extremely high tech that can be used anywhere, anytime, gives immediate feedback to the learner by itself is important. And there are multiple ways in which that kind of high technology can be used to the advantage of the learner. And then dialogue about it afterwards. What were the takeaways? What were, if they can do it over and over and over and have multiple scores, how did their scores progress? How did their scores compare to a classmate's score? Can they put their heads together and find out where their tough, touch points, areas of weakness, areas of strength? These kinds of high technology really focus on the thinking component. And we've heard anecdotal stories from faculty around the country who have seen unbelievable progress in the way their learners think, especially in these last 6 months with the use of virtual adaptive high technology, that they are better thinkers. Because that's one of the advantages, is that this is what's left. I can't go face to face right now, so I'm going to test the way in which I think and provide rationale to take action. So I think there's also a wonderful spot for this technology in
Right.
basis of teaching and learning, learning outcomes.
Great. Thank you. So one last one before we get to audience questions. Technology aside, everything else aside, where should a school's biggest investment be to improve the quality of their learning going forward?
Well, the learning is only as good as the faculty who teach it. You can have all the technology in the world, and if you don't have people who know how to use teaching and learning principles in line with that technology, you're not going to be any further ahead than if you didn't have it in the first place. So we just feel so strongly in, the innovation has exposed this need for faculty who are excited now about where they can actually see the gaps in what is working for them and what is not working for them. And the more we can invest in faculty time to provide that expertise, to buff up the areas that they're needing a little bit more guidance with, the better off we're going to be. I know, we've been on this journey together, both Laerdal and NLN, and really trying to focus, especially as we've talked about developing faculty's use of simulation and how do you bring that across the curriculum. So teaching how to teach is really an important component.
That's
here.
the cornerstone.
Yeah.
Sure. Absolutely. So let's turn to some audience questions, and we will try to get to, there's 25 questions right now, so we're going to do our utmost, and then we'll need just 1 minute right before the top of the hour to wrap up. So here we go. This one's an easy one. How can maybe it's not. How can nursing programs partner with hospitals to help prepare the students who missed clinical needs with COVID and who are struggling with the transference to professional nursing? So I know the NLN's been following that.
Yeah, well, and we have, along with all of many other nursing organizations across the country, that was a call out for schools of nursing to collaborate with their clinical practice partners. You know, that's a tough situation, and right now part of it is we're always a little perplexed as to why students aren't allowed in clinical settings when, especially when they're eminently ready to graduate and they're going to be in there anyway. How, um, you know, those are the times where our learners can be effective in some ways. So I think it's about establishing that relationship. Maybe it's one or two clinical practice partners and meeting to decide how are we going to best meet each other's needs. Having some conversations with schools across the country. And interestingly enough, in this time of COVID, dedicated education units are resurfacing again. And that is to control the type of student coming into the environment, and a collaboration between the nurses on that unit who want to teach at the bedside, who love being clinical nurse educators at the bedside, and collaborate with the classroom educators so that you become a full teaching team, and that those units encompass those learners as part of that care team as well. So there's a lot of models out there, and I think it's reaching out to your deans to establish those conversations with those you know, clinical practice partners in your areas.
Very good. Thank you. The next two are closely linked, and I just want to say for the audience, they will have access to a copy of this presentation afterwards. So references to the articles mentioned earlier in the Horizon report and so forth, I'll hold those to the end. So please don't think that we're ignoring those. But I'd like to move on to these other questions first, and hopefully we'll get to those. So here's the next question, Susan. Isn't going to the virtual option, virtual teaching, isn't going to the virtual option driving us back to more lecture-like classes?
Mm. No, I don't think it is. I think teaching online and virtual, if it's done right, is actually harder than being in the classroom, because you really have to have a conversation. It's too easy to tape a lecture and expect that your learners are getting anything out of it. That to me is an online teaching. Online teaching is engaging someone in a virtual environment to and creating context in that moment. Because they're on the screen, and because it's harder to control what else they might be doing in their environment that you can't see. You know, I think it is more challenging and more exciting. There's so many more opportunities that you can use technology in creative ways, and breakout sessions, and online discussion features like Padlet, which is old, you know, K through 12 is using that. And some of the shared screen opportunities for interactive Google screens. And I just think that the more creative we can be to capture engagement with online learning, it won't look anything like we've taught. And I think going backwards is, you know, people say, well, I can't wait till we get back to normal. Well, I kind of hope we don't. I kind of hope that, you know, as it relates to allowing clinicals, absolutely yes. Allowing, you know, practice and work in simulation labs, absolutely yes. You know, without those fears, but to really embrace the use of virtual teaching and technology, I think this has raised that awareness.
Absolutely. And if Will Brewer is on the line, Will Brewer's one of our past Sun speakers. He actually started using TikTok to start getting his messages across to students. So we've seen a lot of different avenues to keep people engaged. It's interesting, and some people are commenting that they've actually seen engagement go up during this time. So here's a closely related question, and I think and because it's a rather long question, I'm going to paraphrase one part of it. I believe that the person asking is concerned about chaos in how we teach nurses. So here's the first part of the question, and that's what I'll share verbatim. If we stop teaching content and focus only on how to use content, is the process of learning content the complete responsibility now of the student?
Well, active learning requires that it's a two-way street. Active learning requires that some of the learners do some heavy lifting as much as faculty do. The content is driven by the outcomes. And your outcomes are performance-based in some ways. What do you expect learners to be able to do? So if you're expecting them to be able to do certain things, then you should be setting up your learning environments that give them an opportunity to practice achieving what it is you're attempting to try to have them take away. And that really gets at, learning theories where we're driving learning to that higher end. All types of teaching strategies include some level of delivering content, but if that's all you're doing, then learners set up an expectation that they don't have to read the textbook because you're doing the work. You're going through the textbook and deciding what's important and summarizing it and putting it on PowerPoint slides, and you're giving them. That's why the students just want your PowerPoint slides, because those are going to be the key to getting the questions on the tests. And while we might get good NCLEX outcomes, what we're seeing in the hospitals is this lack of ability to do the job, to be the nurse that we wanted them to be, because we're not teaching them in how to practice using it. So it drives back to your learning outcomes. And if your outcomes are driven or written in the way that you're expecting certain performance measures to be met, then your classroom activities should drive that. And that would be how I'd respond to that.
Very good. So here's a question. I'm going to combine two questions here. So if you've got an unfolding case where you do need student interaction, how do you convince students that there is value in that interaction?
Well, you can't, excuse me.
I guess you can only set the table.
Well, you're right. You can't convince a student of anything. It's the same thing as we often say in SIM. Well, this is a safe environment. You can say that till the cows come home. And yeah, the student, it's the perception of the student feeling safe that is at stake here. So if you have to convince a student that this particular learning activity is really important and they're going to get the best out of it, unless they feel it, unless you're walking the talk, so it's all about how you deliver it and the transparency. People can talk to you and say something and you won't believe it. You've got to feel it, be part of it, experience it. And you may flop a couple times. I mean, you're always going to flop when you try something new. I have many times, and as long as I'm honest with my learners that didn't go as I expected, so we're going to try something different. We're all human. And I think sometimes we try to put ourselves too high on a pedestal with our learners that they're expecting perfection from us. And, perception is what you're trying, perception is theirs. We can't, all we can do is do the best job we can to have them embrace that and feel that.
Very good. Here's one from the faculty perspective. What is the best strategy to promote faculty buy-in for educational best practices? It's sometimes hard to see faculty colleagues not offering this and not actually buying into the idea of faculty development.
Excuse me. Well, one of the ways that we had to do that was that we had to provide the faculty development initiatives so that faculty understood what the best practices were and give them opportunities to practice it. And then it became where, as we were changing out curricula to have it be an active learning kind of a curricular environment, we did it by levels so that faculty weren't playing lone read. I think sometimes, unfortunately, in academia, our survival is dependent on our student evaluations, which you can get slammed. And if you're a faculty trying to do something innovative with best practices and it flops, you know, students are going to call you out.
Sure.
And so we've often found it best to start at a leveled approach. So all the faculty working with one level of students engages in those same best practices and active learning strategies so that learners can't peg one faculty from another doing different things. So you have to be somewhat strategic about how you provide the safety net for faculty, especially for those that are really not comfortable trying on some of these new things. And it may be team teaching and providing partners so that they can work some things out together in the classroom, or have someone that can work with them if not directly in the classroom. So there are ways to do it. It has to be thoughtful and it takes time. It isn't something that's going to happen overnight, but small steps then too will show the faculty the support that's being given.
Excellent.
Building it up.
Dripping water on a stone. Eventually, you wear it down. Susan, you've been awesome. Those are all the questions we'll have time to take. It's such a pleasure to have you here. Again, Susan Gross Forneris from the Center for Innovation Education Excellence at the National League for Nursing. We so appreciate all your time. And
Andrew, it's been my pleasure, and I so value the work that the NLN does alongside our colleagues at Laerdal Medical. You guys are doing a phenomenal job. So thank you for this opportunity.
Well, we're humbled and we're certainly privileged, and the feeling is mutual. For those that are interested in the resources, some resources from today, first of all, if you'd like to stay in touch with Susan, please contact nln.org. Since COVID is still with us, please check out our COVID Resource Center. Please join our Sun Facebook community by going to the Facebook page and go to groups Laerdal Sun, and that's an exclusive opportunity for those who have attended this broadcast. And please stay tuned for some future webinars. Susan, I hope that you'll attend these. We've got a great webinar coming up, a virtual Sun, October 28th, improving remote simulation outcomes using the INACSL standards of best practice. And December 8th, a virtual Sun session that we're doing in conjunction with Modern Healthcare Magazine, Expose, Explore, and Promote Equitable Care Through Patient Simulation. I think that one's going to be a great one too. Susan, again, thank you, and thank you to our audience who's been listening. Everyone have a great day. We appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Make it a great one.